Hi, sleeping for hours family. Before you sleep, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our nightly videos. Picture an old man in a plain shirt, hunched over a chessboard on a quiet Miami beach afternoon. Sunlight slips through palm fronds, waves hush against the sand, and seagulls quarrel over scraps. He lifts a rook, pauses, then lets the piece hover above the square as if reviewing 10 futures at once. People around him don't point or crowd. They glance, whisper, and keep walking. His name can't be stamped on a billboard or shouted in a parade. It travels softer, like a secret between two friends on a city stoop. He built a life with pencils, odds, and quiet. No flashy suits, no roaring crowds, no public boasts. Yet behind that stillness was a web of money that touched docks, casinos, racetracks, hotel lobbies, and back rooms where the light stayed low. His power didn't look like thunder. It sounded like a ledger closing. The man at the board was Meyer Lansky, and the game he played most of his life wasn't chess, it was control. He entered the world far from Atlantic tides. Born Meyer Lansky on July 4, 1902 in Grodno, then part of the Russian Empire. He grew up in a place where fear could arrive with a knock or a shout, and where prejudice could twist a day into something dangerous. Like many families who looked west and saw a promise across the ocean, his parents wanted safety and steady work. New York took them in, as it did so many, and the Lower East Side provided a long introduction to America. The neighborhood was cramped and loud. Windows opened to fire escapes, streets swarmed with pushcarts, and tenements squeezed whole lives into narrow rooms. But that hard landscape made quick thinkers and fast learners. Meyer learned English, learned to navigate, learned that what you didn't say could protect you. He was small, quiet, watchful. He liked numbers. In class, he solved problems faster than most, and treated arithmetic like a language. On the streets, he noticed how games worked, how stakes rose when tempers did, how luck isn't the same as probability. Dice rattled on stoops, cards flashed under gaslight, coins moved between hands. He studied the rhythm and learned to see the edge that math could give. People later called him the mob's accountant, as if he were just a man with a green visor and receipt books. He was more than that. He was a calculator wrapped in flesh, a planner who preferred margins over headlines. In that hive of crowded blocks, Meyer met a boy who didn't move through the world quietly. Benjamin Siegel had a grin that drew eyes and a temper that scattered them. Later the country would learn that name as Bugsy Siegel, though not to his face. The two became friends as teens, different in style but matched in loyalty. Siegel could be a blaze, Meyer was the cooling system. Together they learned fast what the neighborhood offered. Little jobs to keep the rent paid, and the pantry stocked. Favors traded for protection, quick cash from small schemes. Nothing about that path was noble, but it wasn't unusual in those streets in years. They were old enough to pay attention when a new law changed the game. In 1920, the country banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol. Demand didn't vanish. It simply moved out of sight. Where there is demand, a supply will appear, and young men with nerve and friends could make money if they were careful. Bootlegging didn't mean only boats racing along dark coastlines. It meant trusting the right drivers, finding safe storage, bribing the right official, paying on time, keeping tempers low, and avoiding mistakes. Meyer found opportunity not in brute force but in structure. He preferred to buy, secure, move, and get paid, without drama, because drama attracts the wrong audience. He wasn't a lone operator. There was a network, and at its far-sighted end stood Arnold Rothstein, a gambler with patience and a taste for smooth suits. Rothstein had already taught New York a lesson about brains outlasting fists. He wasn't Meyer's employer in any formal way, but he was a mentor by example, a figure whose methods Meyer admired. Rothstein believed in systems, runners, schedules, disciplined payouts, clear percentages. He saw the prohibition economy like a chessboard. Meyer took that idea and made it his own. Numbers could turn the street into a ledger, and a ledger could guide every move. With Siegel beside him, Meyer helped shape a crew people later called the Bugs and Meyer outfit. The name hinted at Siegel's reputation, but its true engine was organization. They guarded shipments for bigger outfits, bought and sold product in bulk, and aimed to keep losses down. They also protected themselves against hijackers who saw trucks full of liquor as a quick payday. In those days, men carried guns. Rival groups did too. Violence stalked the business whether you wanted it or not. Meyer's method was to keep trouble from ever needing a loud answer. If you let your temper run your business, you didn't run a business for long. He learned to pay fair, keep schedules tight, and insist on calm. That policy didn't make him soft, it made him strategic. The city's underworld was changing. Old bosses, often called mustache Petes, clung to rules rooted in the past. Young men with broader horizons looked toward a national map and a modern way of doing organized crime. Meyer found allies in that new camp, most notably Charles "Lucky" Luciano and Frank Costello. The trio didn't look alike, didn't sound alike, didn't come from the same corners, but they agreed on a central truth: money flows better when decisions follow logic. They wanted a system that reduced pointless fights and replaced them with votes, shares, and reliable incomes. If it sounds like a boardroom, that's because it was one. Except the products were illegal, and the shareholders couldn't call the police when something went wrong. By the late 1920s, as prohibition roared, the underworld's map started shifting. Turf lines moved, alliances flexed, and everyone watched everyone else. A 1929 gathering in Atlantic City, reported by later writers and widely discussed by historians, symbolized this push toward national coordination. Many of the city's major figures came together to talk about avoiding senseless wars and dividing profits with a cool head. Meyer wasn't the loudest voice in any room, but he was there, listening, counting, measuring outcomes. He didn't need a spotlight to influence the plan. He needed a pencil, and the trust of men who understood that chaos bleeds money. Then came the Castellammares War of 1930-31, a brutal struggle in New York between factions led by Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. The streets felt the tension the way a barometer feels a storm. Each side tested the other. Luciano moved with care, playing both edges until the balance shifted. The killings that ended that war changed the city's underworld forever. Luciano emerged as the most powerful figure, and the old order, with its strict ethnic lines and antique customs, gave way to something new. Meyer supported the reorganization and provided a framework for its accounting. He didn't ride at the front of any parade. He adjusted the wiring behind the wall. The product of this upheaval was a structure journalists later called the Commission, a board meant to regulate business, settle disputes, and spread decisions across families so that no single boss could throw the whole machine off course. At the same time, a broader national coordination of crime, a loose syndicate, grew around shared interests, with Meyer's financial brain serving as a clearinghouse for profits from illegal gambling, bookmaking, and other rackets. His specialty was making dirty money seem to appear and disappear on cue, swapping locations, smoothing proceeds across fronts, and keeping the numbers straight. He had no talent for spectacle, and he wanted none. He had a talent for turning risk into yield and disputes into agreements. Quiet made money. Even then, with lawmen watching and rivals prowling, he kept the temperature low. If business had to be protected, it was done without show. Enforcement existed, crews that punished thieves and traitors, but Meyer's preference was to limit that side, because violence, especially public violence, brings headlines, and headlines bring attention, and attention splinters an operation. The difference between a reckless mob and a managed enterprise is the difference between flame and heat. He wanted heat, controlled and useful. He also saw that gambling dwarfed other rackets in one crucial way: predictable cash flow. Alcohol would one day become legal again. Gambling stayed illegal in most places, but the desire to wager never ended. Track bets, numbers games, card rooms, and casino floors generated steady returns if you controlled the odds and kept the skim invisible. He started strengthening connections in places where gambling ran under the table. Hot Springs, Arkansas, offered a refuge for bettors and bookies under local protection. Florida's warm coast beckoned with sunshine tourists and off-the-books rooms where dice clicked after midnight. He didn't just look at today's take. He looked for hubs, routes, and reliable remitters who counted out shares exactly as instructed. As he grew in stature, Meyer kept a narrow profile. He let others enjoy the camera flash. He wore plain suits and stuck to careful routines. He avoided talk on open lines, preferred meetings in person, and used intermediaries he could trust. When he moved cash, he moved it through layers, smoothing corners so that tracking proved difficult. Investigators later claimed he grew adept at routing profits through foreign accounts and hard-to-penetrate banks. Officials spent years trying to map who owned what, where shares went, and how losses were absorbed. The picture never came into full focus, partly because the money seldom stayed still long enough to be photographed. He wasn't a saint. He broke laws for a living, and he profited from systems that exploited human weakness. He lent to illegal rooms, fixed percentages, and took a slice from bookmaking networks. He used intimidation when he believed it necessary. He supported alliances with men who made their reputations enforcing discipline in chilling ways. He built channels through bribery. He outfoxed tax collectors where he could. When he faced legal threats, he hired ruthless lawyers and poked holes in cases until they leaked. He never confused what he did with goodness. He saw himself as an organizer inside a landscape that many had created: law, demand, and human desire, and he took control of the traffic that poured through it. The public first heard his name during the Prohibition years, mainly as a rumor beside bigger headlines: Capone this, shootout that, but people inside the life understood who the steady hand was. When a meeting needed someone who could keep tempers down and pencils moving, Meyer sat quietly, asked precise questions, and did the math. You didn't have to like him, you had to respect his results. If someone proposed a fast scheme with sparkles around it, he asked how it would look in a month, a year, 5 years. If an associate asked for credit, he checked the man's history before the ink hit paper. Nothing about his method was romantic, that's why it worked. He kept old friends close, even as paths diverged. Siegel flew west to explore Hollywood, and later the Nevada desert, as Las Vegas took shape. Luciano's star rose, fell, and adapted. Frank Costello cultivated influence in clubs where the air smelled more of cologne than gun oil. Through it all, Meyer's base remained the books, where the cash went, what percentage went back, what margin could be trimmed without causing revolt. He tracked the rising tide of gambling revenue as cities changed, laws shifted, and the country learned to love neon nights. He didn't chase glamour, he built pipelines. In those first years after Prohibition, the government turned its eyes from liquor to a wider map of organized crime. Committees would soon drag names into hearing rooms, and headlines would turn quiet men into public figures whether they wanted that or not. For now, however, in the early 1930s, the reorganization of New York's underworld marked a turning point. The old leadership had been removed. The new order, better dressed and better managed, preferred conference tables to street corners when possible. Behind them, in a seat rarely photographed, sat Meyer Lansky, pencil ready, eyes calm, calculating not just today's score, but the sustainability of tomorrow's. He wasn't the only mind building this framework, but he became a symbol for a style that treated crime as an enterprise rather than a spree. That shift had consequences. It kept the machine humming longer than most thought possible. It also meant a paper trail, however faint, and trails invite pursuit. Authorities began connecting dots. Gambling dens in one state, racing wire services in another, cash skimming here, payoff there, and a set of names that appeared repeatedly near the center. Meyer could anticipate these patterns, and often stayed a step ahead. He emphasized layers, buffers, and plausible deniability. He appeared as a consultant rather than an owner, as a lender rather than a manager, as a man who could collect a percentage without leaving fingerprints. The man at the chessboard didn't win by force. He won by position, by structure, by anticipating where pressure would come and where relief was needed. That approach drew allies from every corner of the map and irritated rivals who preferred noise. It also prepared him for the next period of his life, when shipping lanes, foreign ports, and hotel lobbies would become his favorite terrain, and when his obsession with odds would meet a country's growing appetite for a roll of the dice. The end of Prohibition should have closed a chapter, but for Meyer, it opened a better one. Booze had been a short-term wave, loud and risky. Gambling was a river, steady and quiet if you controlled the banks. In 1933, the country changed the law, and liquor returned to bars with hangings of new licenses. Crews that lived off smuggling scrambled. Meyer did what he always did. He stepped back, rewrote the plan, and followed the numbers toward the stack that would never stop growing. Bets. A roll of the dice. A hand of cards. A wager on a horse. A column of digits scratched onto a small slip in a back room. Those were recurring. Every day, every night, in every town that had a bar, a barber, or a corner store. The reshaped underworld needed rules if it wanted to avoid burning itself down. The new council that organized the biggest families and the allies around them set out to reduce pointless fights. People later called it the Commission. There were seats for those who ran New York's 5 families, and influence for trusted partners elsewhere. It was not a legislature. It was a circuit breaker. It turned personal feuds into scheduled meetings and votes. It also relied on compliance, and when persuasion failed, there were men who specialized in final warnings. Newspapers would name that enforcement wing Murder Inc. The term was dramatic, but it only captured the headline, not the logic behind the system. Meyer didn't build that crew, but he accepted that the syndicate would use force when it felt cornered. His preference never changed. solve problems before anyone reached for a weapon. A balance sheet was his hammer. He and Frank Costello saw the future in metal boxes and small levers. Slot machines had a simple appeal. They didn't need dealers. They didn't argue. They didn't ask for raises. If you placed them in enough bars, candy shops, and roadhouses, coins would clink into trays with a rhythm you could measure. New York's mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, declared war on those machines in the mid-1930s. Crews watched truckloads of slots seized and smashed. Costello shrugged and called for the loading docks. If a city didn't want them, another would. Louisiana smiled. New Orleans embraced tourism and tolerated vice when it brought money to town. With local intermediaries, notably men like Phil Castell, they built a network that fed coins into counting rooms and sent a steady share back to the partners in New York. The route from shock in Manhattan to profit on the Gulf Coast showed the method that made Meyer different. Adapt, relocate, keep the lines clean, collect. Numbers betting at the neighborhood level, often called policy, also fit the plan. It ran on trust, quick math, and a community's itch for a small shot at a big return. He didn't stand on street corners taking slips. He backed people who did, standardized rates, and financed collections when there were hiccups. If you think of the economy they ran as a set of pipes, numbers and slots were the main lines. Card rooms filled in the gaps. Florida, especially parts of Miami, and the towns near the racetracks, offered fertile ground. Sunshine tourists, wintering northerners, and locals all loved a table. A hotel backroom could be rearranged after dinner to host quiet games. Partnerships with owners gave cover and a way to dampen noise when a curious official wandered by. Not everything could be smoothed with a handshake. The racing wire service, fast information on which horses had scratched, which odds had shifted, who was favored at post time, was a lifeline for bookmakers. Control that wire, and you influenced every bet in the country that relied on up-to-the-minute information. Publishers and mob figures fought to dominate it. When Moses Annenberg's empire faltered under federal pressure, others battled to shape what followed. Outfits in Chicago, Cleveland, and New York leaned into the void. Disputes flared, some ending in hospitals and morgues. Meyer was not the frontman in that brawl, but he leveraged whatever service existed to keep his bookmaking network humming. He invested, placed intermediaries between himself and local operators, and demanded punctual payments. He never forgot that the most valuable commodity in gambling wasn't luck. It was timing. He kept a low profile, but he wasn't invisible. Investigators began to sketch his outline as a person who lent money to illegal rooms, set percentages for bookmakers, brokered peace among rivals, and collected interest on loans that kept operations alive. Politicians who needed campaign funds or quiet help with a cousin's problem learned to listen. Police commanders occasionally found envelopes on desks they didn't remember opening. That was the reality of the time. Corruption chipped away at the wall between law and markets that didn't want to be licensed. Meyer didn't have illusions about virtue. He was buying breathing room. The crackdown on Lucky Luciano in 1936 shook the board. Thomas Dewey, a tireless prosecutor, turned Manhattan courtrooms into stages where the country watched big names fall. Luciano was convicted and sent away. Many expected the syndicate to stumble. It didn't. Frank Costello stepped forward in political rooms. Vito Genovese hovered, ambitious. Albert Anastasia held a fearsome reputation among enforcers. Meyer, as usual, stayed behind the curtain. He focused on keeping gaming revenue steady, shoring up relations in Florida, and maintaining the southern slot machine pipeline. When something threatened a cash route, he reviewed contingencies and switched lanes before anyone noticed. The Navy came calling when the war arrived. In 1942, after fires and rumors of sabotage on New York's docks, naval intelligence wanted stability at the waterfront. The harbor was the throat of the Eastern War effort. Cargo had to move without fear of arson or disruption. Luciano's name surfaced because dockside unions and stevedores respected certain men more than they did federal memos. Accounts differ on who precisely introduced whom, but Meyer appears in several retellings as a bridge between the government and figures who could calm that world. The program that followed, often called Operation Underworld, traded influence for peace. The docks grew quiet. The Navy gained confidence that shipments would leave on schedule. Years later, Luciano won parole and was deported, with his supporters pointing to wartime cooperation as evidence that he had helped. Meyer saw the bargain as pragmatic. When war needs something, you supply it if you can, then return to your usual business. His family life, seldom discussed, existed in the spaces between trips and meetings. He had married Anna Citron back in 1929. They had children, and for stretches he tried to be present, then work would pull him away again. The marriage strained and finally broke in the late 1940s. He later married Thelma, known as Teddy. Friends said he adored his children and wanted them far from his world. He kept his home life plain, ate modest meals, walked without entourage, and left the swagger to others. A quiet domestic routine, when he could manage it, steadied his mind for the endless calculations his work demanded. On the West Coast, Benjamin Siegel reinvented himself as a man fluent in Hollywood charm. He dressed sharp, made friends in studios, dined at places where tablecloths glowed under soft light, and handled problems for associates who appreciated his nerve. He had always been a streak of lightning, brave, impulsive, magnetic. Los Angeles tolerated him until it didn't. Police pressure and new cases made him restless. A desert city in Nevada called, promising something different, legal casinos under a state's watch, backed by investors who didn't want their names in the paper. Las Vegas was a railroad stop with dust, a few clubs and long roads to nowhere. Siegel believed it could become a wonder of neon. Meyer liked Las Vegas for a simple reason. If a state chose to legalize gaming, a casino could buy supplies in the open, hire staff without worry, and welcome visitors legally. The rake would be visible, but the overhead and legal exposure would be lower than in an illegal room. He sent money through respected fronts to avoid headlines, offered advice on design and control, and urged discipline. When Siegel took over the Flamingo project, the budget blew past every estimate. The desert laughed at schedules. Materials cost more than planned. Contractors padded bills. Friends took liberties. Some of the money went where it shouldn't have. Reports flowed east, complaining about delays and missing cash. Meyer traveled west, inspected ledgers, and tried to impose order without crushing Siegel's pride. At the same time, Cuba was growing louder in his thoughts. Havana offered warm weather, music in open courtyards, and a government that, at various times, showed an appetite for tourism revenue. Gambling fit that tourism pitch. Late in the 1930s and during the war years, he visited, took measure of hotels, and met go-betweens. He didn't yet have the power to shape policy there, but he understood what the island could become if the right partners held office. Those notes would matter after the war, when Fulgencio Batista returned to power and signaled a willingness to license casinos that catered to foreign visitors with money to spend. Meyer imagined modern rooms with trained dealers, bright entertainment, and a floor plan that guided guests through table after table while the skim moved discreetly to safe places. He could already hear the dice. The war ended, and the underworld sought a new equilibrium. Luciano, living in Italy after his parole, still commanded respect. In late 1946, a grand meeting in Havana brought the major figures together in one place under the ceiling of a famous hotel. There were songs in the ballroom, women in gowns, and a breeze that carried salt from the sea. Behind the public sparkle, the men talked. They discussed narcotics rules and distribution routes, always a subject that split rooms since many disliked the heat it brought, and far more urgently, the Flamingo's money problem. Siegel's overruns and the opening glitches had frayed nerves. Investors wanted a plan. Meyer argued to give his old friend one more chance, to push through the early stumbles and reach a steady profit. They agreed to watch the books closely. He knew loyalty couldn't be the only argument in that room, but he also knew how it felt to abandon someone you had grown up with. He staked his reputation on the hope that Siegel could finish strong. The Flamingo's first months were bumpy. The opening around Christmas in 1946 drew stars, but not enough steady players. The hotel rooms were unfinished, which meant gamblers didn't linger. Money bled, pressure mounted. Then slowly, things improved. The rooms opened, the marketing sharpened. The floor got busier. A climb began. But the syndicate had run out of patience. In June 1947, bullets shattered a glass window in a Beverly Hills home where Siegel was reading. He died on the spot. The killing shocked the city. Theories multiplied in the press. Unpaid debts, lawsuits, personal grudges, orders from the very men who had invested. No court ever fixed blame in a way that satisfied the hunger for a single answer. Meyer received the news with a face that gave away little. Those close to him said grief snapped at him hard, and that he excused himself from a room to let the wave pass. He had lobbied to save Siegel, and failed. The next day, the Flamingo's keys changed hands without fuss. Under Mo Sedway and others, the casino turned profitable in short order. For all the legends that cast Meyer as a puppeteer, he often looked more like an air traffic controller. Planes approached from every direction. Florida card rooms, southern slots, Havana dreams, West Coast casinos, racing wires, illegal bookmakers in dozens of cities, and his job was to prevent collisions. He kept capital flowing to rooms that earned and cut off credit to rooms that lied. He ensured that allies in city halls were never starved of campaign help when they faced tough races, because friendly officials made inspections go away. He spread ownership across layers of fronts, so that a subpoena could only reach the third layer, not the fifth. He made sure that if one city lit up with raids, others kept the river moving. He accepted that federal attention was permanent, and that the best defense wasn't a wall, it was smoke. The Internal Revenue Service studied him with special patience. The Treasury had learned in the Capone era that tax law could reach where other statutes stumbled. Meyer's own returns showed modest income. His taste for simple living disguised wealth parked in loans, hidden shares and property held under borrowed names. He invested abroad. Banks in Switzerland and other havens welcomed deposits that didn't ask for a name in big letters. Money moved through brokerage accounts, hotel companies, dummy vendors, and foreign corporations. Agents built binders and waited for a mistake. He made fewer than most. When they cornered him on small matters, he would pay fines, or beat the case with meticulous records that showed a loan, not profit, a consultation, not control. His discipline contrasted with the flamboyance that sank others. At this stage, his reputation settled into a paradox. He was both everywhere and nowhere. Journalists labeled him the mob's accountant, an easy phrase that fell short of his actual reach. He was a strategist who preferred arithmetic to speeches, a contractor who built systems then declined to put his name on the door. He could be courteous with officials while holding firm in private about percentages that were not subject to debate. He could sit for hours in a quiet room with ledgers, a cigarette burning down, and map out solutions that turned panic into routine. He knew that lives got broken by gambling debts, that families suffered when a father lost a paycheck at a table he had financed, that bribery warped public trust. He rationalized his role as someone who supplied the products people sought, and who tried to keep excess violence from spilling into the open. That was how he slept. Whether that satisfied anyone else is a different question. His business thrived because human beings like risk and stories. He sold both, wrapped in felt and neon. After Siegel's death, Las Vegas moved from an experiment to a blueprint. If one resort could turn profitable with modern management, others could follow. You could see the future in the sightlines from the casino floor to the stage, the layout that steered guests past the pit to the bar, the subtlety of the credit desk where a high roller could sign for more chips without drama. Quiet skims paid investors far away. Auditors loyal to the backers made sure cash registers reconciled with the count room. It wasn't magic, it was systems. Havana remained the other jewel waiting to be set. In the late 1940s, Batista signaled that the island would welcome hotel projects that brought tourist dollars. Meyer courted hoteliers, musicians, and promoters. He pictured world-class rooms where a guest could listen to a band from New York, watch a floor show, then walk 20 steps to a green baize table. Licenses would be issued, taxes paid, and percentages tucked away. Cuba's location made it a beautiful hub for visitors from the United States and Latin America, and for money that didn't want to be noticed. He believed he could build a legal facade with efficient machinery behind it, a blend he had been training for since the docks of New York. The man's toolkit didn't change. Find predictable revenue, spread risk, build trust with partners who delivered, cut losses when promises failed, avoid humiliation, and never brag. Through the 1930s and 1940s, that kit kept him above the waves that drowned louder men. If there was a secret, it was this: he never mistook the thrill of the game for the business of it. The thrill belonged to bettors, the business belonged to him. Miami Beach in the late 1940s felt like a long exhale. The ocean breathed in and out, the palms rattled, and a small man in a plain jacket could sit on a bench and watch the boardwalk traffic. He liked habits that didn't draw attention. He read the paper cover to cover, circled numbers, jotted odds in a tiny notebook, and then folded it away so neatly it seemed to vanish. The loud era of prohibition was gone. What remained was his favorite terrain, a country that bet on everything, and a manager who knew how to turn that habit into steady, quiet income. Television crept into living rooms, and with it came a new kind of spotlight. In 1950, a Senate inquiry into organized crime began holding hearings around the country. The name most people remember is Kefauver. He wore a coonskin cap on the campaign trail later, but in those moments he wore a sober suit and asked detailed questions. The hearings were a novelty. Cameras stared, microphones amplified whispers, and men who had always been shadows had to speak under bright lights. Millions watched. They saw bookmakers, fixers, bagmen, and bosses try to explain lives they had never meant to explain. Meyer was called. He dressed simply, sat straight, spoke softly, and chose words with care. He had no interest in a performance. He rejected the idea that he was in charge of anybody, said he was a businessman, denied running a nationwide ring, and replied in a way that gave away little. On some questions he declined to answer. A lawyer at his elbow objected when inquiries drifted beyond fair ground. He didn't charm the room like Frank Costello, whose fidgeting hands on camera became their own story, but he also didn't stumble. The committee had bigger targets and louder witnesses. When the hearings ended, the country had a new vocabulary: syndicate, wire service, skimming, but not many convictions. The main change was public awareness. The lights had been switched on, and they never went off again. After the hearings, he doubled down on discretion. Miami Beach was his base, but his reach felt like a net thrown across the map. Arkansas drew him because Hot Springs had a tradition of open betting tucked behind respectable storefronts, a place where law and custom had negotiated a truce. An Englishman turned local kingpin, Owen Madden, had taken refuge there years earlier, and the town's operators appreciated order. New Orleans beckoned too, a port city with music in its bones and a long tolerance for games of chance. Local bosses, including Carlos Marcello and Phil Castell, managed politics and paid attention to who financed machines and rooms. Meyer didn't run their towns, he invested, lent, audited, and collected. When disputes flared, he tried to settle them before they could catch fire. Nothing in gambling mattered more than information. The racing wire, a network that sent results and scratches to bookmakers everywhere, had been a battlefield for years. Publishers, gamblers, and gang figures fought to own or influence the services that fed that stream. The names changed. The outfits behind the teletypes rose and fell as prosecutors pressed cases. But the logic didn't. If you controlled the timing of information, you could shape odds, settle bets, and reduce the house's surprises. Meyer placed money into whichever service could promise stability, made sure his own bookmaking partners had reliable feeds, and punished any middleman who tried to shave from his end. He believed in standards. If a collector arrived late or fudged numbers, that collector didn't keep the job. The slot machine pipeline to the Gulf Coast had been rescued after New York smashed them in the mid-1930s, and it grew through the 1940s. Bars in Louisiana liked the revenue that clinked into trays. The machines paid small prizes and big hope. They also paid rent for operators, taxes for local offices that made room for them, and percentages for the silent partners who had purchased them in bulk. When a mayor grew restless, or a district attorney decided to make a name, the route shifted to friendlier parishes. The lesson was the same in every state. Never get rooted so deeply that one headline could sever your line. Las Vegas, meanwhile, turned from a whisper into a plan. The Flamingo had recovered after Siegel's death, and now proved that a modern resort could make steady profits if the back office was tight. Other properties expanded. Mo Dalitz, a former bootlegger turned builder, brought finesse to the Desert Inn. The Sands drew singers who filled the showroom, and if you looked from certain tables, the stage felt like another game where odds favored the house. Financing came from banks that enjoyed publicity and from less photogenic sources, including union pension funds that wanted good returns. Those loans flowed through men who knew both worlds and promised repayment schedules that never missed a date. Meyer's name did not appear in the prospectuses. He sat in quiet suites, read the ledgers, and advised on controls, especially the invisible part, how to count cash so that a precise sliver peeled away before the outside auditors ever saw it. Nevada's regulators took their job seriously, especially after the early rowdy years. The state built a blacklist of people it did not want near a pit or a cage. Licenses were scrutinized. Backers learned to hide behind layers. Companies that owned companies that owned companies. Meyer accepted that he would never hold a license. He didn't need one to influence a count room or to remind a manager that a certain line on a certain page needed to come in on time. The trick was to be present without being present, to ensure that a property ran clean enough to satisfy Carson City but not so clean that partners went hungry. If Vegas was a legal oasis under a state's eyes, Cuba was a sunlit frontier that promised something else, a blend of tourist spectacle and permissive oversight. In 1952, Fulgencio Batista returned power. He wanted dollars from the North, and he understood that visitors would spend more if they had games to play at night. By the mid-1950s, Havana's administration drafted laws that licensed casinos, set taxes, and offered incentives to investors who built hotels. The government formed a gambling commission to write standards and collect fees. Meyer became an advisor of sorts, unofficial yet influential, consulting on how to design tables, train dealers, and set internal controls that maximized profits while keeping inspectors satisfied. It was a job he had been practicing his whole life. He backed ventures that blended glamour with bookkeeping. The Capri opened with polished service and a sharp floor. The Nacional, long a symbol of Havana's high society, revived its casino under new management that listened to his advice. His crown jewel was a sleek cliffside resort built for spectacle and flow. It opened in 1957, with shows that drew celebrities from the United States and Latin America. The lobby sparkled, the pool curved toward the sea, and the casino floor felt like a promise in lights. Visitors remembered the performers and the cool air in the showroom. Meyer remembered the daily totals, the drop boxes, the spread between table hold and payroll. He watched everything. He was not the only investor. Santo Traficante Jr. of Tampa leveraged family ties to the island and took stakes in rooms of his own. Cuban partners with political pull helped arrange licenses. Musicians, restaurateurs, and promoters lined up to share the boom. Money flowed through banks willing to extend credit, and private couriers carried envelopes to quiet offices where shares were divided. The take funded payrolls and construction, paid taxes to the government, and moved a reserved portion to accounts far away. Investigators later said he kept part of the profits in Swiss banks under layers that made tracing difficult. They spent years trying to map the path and never quite caught up. Back in the United States, the underworld had its own shocks. In 1957, a New York summit in a rural town called Appalachian ended in chaos when state troopers broke up the gathering. Dozens of figures fled across lawns into the woods. The headlines reinforced what Kefauver had tried to show. Crime might be local in practice, but its leaders talked on a national scale. Meyer managed to avoid that debacle. He had learned to skip any meeting that could be compromised and to favor small circles over grand assemblies. After Appalachian, the FBI expanded its campaigns. State commissions tightened rules, and friendly officials grew careful about being seen with the wrong dinner guests. The heat rose a degree in every room. Florida remained central to his routine. He liked Miami Beach because it offered both anonymity and access. He could hold a breakfast meeting at a deli without making a scene, spend an hour in a hotel lobby guiding a bookmaker's budget, and then disappear into a walk along Collins Avenue. The racetracks at Hialeah and Gulfstream drew bettors. That meant rooms for card play, private dice in suites, and a flow of phone bets that bookies needed to settle. He did not run wire rooms himself. He financed men who ran them and insisted on schedules that would please a bank manager. If someone fell behind, he listened to the reason, checked the math, and either extended mercy or cut the line. The decision depended on trust and history, not charm. His home life always appeared ordinary from the street. After his first marriage ended, he married Teddy, who preferred quiet too. They hosted small dinners. Close friends said he adored his children, worried over one child's health issues, and spent freely on doctors and caregivers. He wanted the next generation far from police stations and smoky rooms. When reporters tried to make him a caricature, he retreated into routine. Morning coffee, the paper, a swim, a phone call from a manager in another state, a meeting that ended on the dot, a nap, then an evening with his wife. The exterior calm hid the constant arithmetic running in his head. The most dramatic chapter of the decade belonged to Cuba. The island's opposition to Batista grew louder by mid-1958. Bombings rattled Havana. Rebel columns advanced from the mountains. Nightclubs and casinos sometimes closed early after threats. There were weeks when the government ordered the rooms shut, then opened them again after political pressure. Meyer tried to project steadiness. He reassured partners, kept paying salaries, and reminded everyone that tourists would keep arriving if the hotels kept their standards. He convened managers, reviewed cash positions, and reshuffled credit lines to cushion shocks. He had built a machine. He hated nothing more than a machine that seized. Then, in the first days of 1959, the revolution reached the capital. Batista fled. Crowds filled the streets. The new leadership denounced casinos as symbols of corruption and renewed foreign control. At first, there were mixed signals. Some rooms shut, then reopened briefly under tighter oversight. Others were closed on principle. Young officers stood at doors where tuxedoed greeters had stood the night before. The showrooms went dark. The drop never happened. For a few weeks, optimistic voices said a regulated, lawful gambling scene might survive. That hope died fast. By the end of the year, the doors stayed locked, and the state took control of properties that investors had built under the old regime. Meyer left quickly, moving through airports with little luggage and a face that betrayed nothing. It was a stunning loss. He had installed a system that for a time took him closer to legitimacy than any other project in his life. Licenses, taxes, public shows, famous guests, glossy brochures, and it evaporated almost overnight. The exact amount he lost has been debated by writers ever since. Some figures balloon in retellings. The sensible summary is that he lost far more than pride. Cash reserves vanished, equipment was seized, contracts became scrap, and private stores set aside for emergencies were trapped on an island that had no intention of honoring agreements made with the prior government. He tried to recover what he could through contacts, but recovery was thin. He accepted the hit and started again. He returned to Miami Beach like a burned but standing pine after a fire. He was in his 50s, still sharp, still disciplined, but less enchanted by grand showplaces, and more focused on what he always trusted, small margins earned every day in a dozen cities. He reviewed his stakes in Vegas from a new angle. The Nevada resorts were permanent now, backed by banks and unions, and a state that understood their centrality to the economy. That made them safer than a palace tied to a single foreign administration. He strengthened relationships with people who controlled entertainment calendars and cage procedures rather than whoever had the brightest lobby. He encouraged partners to keep the floor honest enough to withstand inspections and to avoid headlines, because headlines frightened lenders. The losses in Cuba drew more federal attention, not less. Agents were trained to pounce when a target looked vulnerable. They watched him for signs of desperation. They didn't see much. He still ate at the same places, still visited the track with friends, still kept appointments to the minute. He paid lawyers to keep him briefed on cases in every city where his name might be whispered. He paid accountants to prepare returns that balanced precisely, while revealing nothing he didn't have to reveal. When his past came up in court, prosecutors described a man who had financed illegal gaming, bribed officials, laundered cash, and evaded taxes with offshore tricks. The defense countered that he was a consultant and lender whose investments weren't crimes in themselves, and that the government, despite years of pursuit, still hadn't produced records that proved control or the kind of income alleged. He often won on technical ground. He also settled minor matters when fatigue outweighed pride. Friends noticed a new restlessness at the edges. He had always been a builder. The island project had been his most ambitious build. Losing it left a space nothing else could fill. Yet he did what he always did in uncertainty. He made lists. Which city needed capital? Which bookmaker could grow with a loan? Which route for slot machines looked soft? Which hotel manager in Vegas needed a reminder about a percentage he had been slow to send? His memory for numbers was as clean as ever. He avoided talk about Cuba unless someone else insisted. When they did, he shrugged and changed the subject. Nostalgia doesn't move money. In private, he sometimes spoke about odds in a gentler register, using them as a way to explain life to younger relatives. If you control enough steps in a chain, you can shape the outcome. If you don't, you accept the variance. He had controlled many steps in Havana. Politics added a step he could not predict, and it swallowed the rest. That wasn't romance. It was a lesson. By the end of the 1950s, the landscape around him had hardened. Appalachian had scared the country. The Cuban Revolution had ended a glamorous chapter. Nevada had professionalized. Florida remained friendly in pockets but watched closely. The Senate would soon hold new hearings as witnesses in other cases pulled back curtains in unflattering ways. He still had allies, but they had learned the value of distance. You could hear it in their calls. You could see it in their seating charts at restaurants. Everyone knew the work had to continue with more patience and fewer toasts. He cut out extravagance. He had never chased big cars or noisy parties anyway, but now he drew the line even thinner. He preferred coffee shops to clubs, business in daylight to midnight events, checks to cash where it was prudent, couriers only when it was essential. He invested in legal businesses with modest returns if they helped provide cover for travel. He visited doctors more often. He spent time with grandchildren. He read the paper more slowly. He still loved chess. The era that began next would test him in different ways. New federal squads would arrive with fresh energy. New laws would expand surveillance. Old friends would vanish into courtrooms or exile. Las Vegas would rise higher than even Siegel had imagined, with teams of accountants designing games so carefully that the day's hold could be predicted almost to the dollar. And Meyer would face the two fronts he had always tried to hold at bay: a tax case with teeth and a question about where. Finally, a man like him could live out his days without a knock landing too hard on the door. The 1960s began with a new kind of pressure. Miami Beach still looked gentle from a distance. Pastel hotels, soft surf, retirees on porches. But the air around Meyer grew thinner. He adjusted the same way he always did. He changed the route, not the destination. He kept his days simple. Coffee at the counter, a quiet drive, a short swim, then work that left almost no fingerprints, meetings in plain rooms, phone calls that never wandered, notes written in a small hand and carried away in a pocket. Washington's attention sharpened after Appalachian. Younger agents replaced the old guard, and new laws gave them better tools. Robert F. Kennedy took the Justice Department in 1961 and treated illegal gambling and interstate rackets as a public promise. Congress passed rules that made phone betting across state lines a crime. Bookmakers had long relied on telephone bets as their bloodstream. The new ban forced rewiring. Meyer helped partners split states into smaller units, installed buffers between bettors and banks, and coached men to speak in shorthand. He was never the one yelling down a line. He preferred to let a manager take the call, record the action, and report at set times. Information feeds still ruled the game. The racing wire evolved into a mix of private teletype services, sport sheets, and fast calls from tracks. When a service stumbled under subpoena, operators swapped to a fresh channel. He invested in the networks that kept odds current and moved quickly when pressure fell on a node. The principle never changed. If timing stays clean, losses shrink. He scolded any office that missed a posting. He didn't accept excuses about storms or stalled cars. If you promised a 2:05 update, it had to arrive at 2:05. Nevada tightened its gate. In 1960, the state formalized a list of people who were not welcome on casino floors. Reporters called it the Black Book. Meyer's name was in the early editions, as were others who had built the business from the shadows. He accepted the message. He no longer walked through pits and watched dealers work. He chose back hallways and private suites if a visit was necessary at all. He held his advice for rooms where it mattered. The count, the cage, the layout that nudged guests from the lobby to the tables without feeling shoved. He taught the same lesson again and again. The house doesn't need noise. The house needs consistency. After Cuba's doors closed, the map shifted to closer islands. The Bahamas floated only a short flight from Miami, with beaches as white as paper, and officials who saw tourism as a future worth building. Nassau and Freeport made friendly noises to investors who promised nice hotels and controlled gaming. Local power brokers courted Miami money. Businessmen wore linen suits by day and moved in and out of clubs by night. Meyer approached the islands the way he approached every new city. He found intermediaries who spoke the local language, watched which ministers had real pull, and tested loyalty with small tasks before risking larger ones. He was careful to separate names on paper from names in practice. Casinos in Nassau and Freeport opened with live bands and bright rooms. A few of the managers came from crews that had lost their jobs when Havana went dark. They set dice tables, trained dealers, and put soft hands on the wheel at roulette. Visitors liked the feeling of being just far enough from home to relax. Regulators kept a light touch so long as the places stayed friendly and paid their due. Investigators later argued that Meyer had influence behind the scenes, helping with financing, rules, and staff, while staying outside the camera's frame. Nothing was as centralized as in Havana. The islands were smaller, the politics more layered, and the money spread across new partners. But the old habit, quiet skims, tight counts, regular remittances, found a way to fit. Back in the United States, Las Vegas reached for second gear. Resorts learned to think like airlines, tracking occupancy, forecasting win, and smoothing slow weeks with conventions. Unions negotiated wages that kept dealers loyal. Teamsters' pension loans, carried through middlemen who could speak both to bankers and to backrooms, built towers that caught the sun. Lawyers drafted clean contracts. Accountants designed record-keeping that passed state checks. And inside the fine print, investors who had no desire to testify in Carson City still drew a return. Meyer stayed near those returns, not the marquees. He checked how many hands a casino could reasonably expect to play per hour, how the drop compared to the same month last year, and how credit to certain patrons affected hold. He had a gift for hearing numbers and knowing which one rang false. The decade produced new star witnesses. In 1963, a low-ranking soldier named Joseph Valachi spoke before a Senate panel and told the country about a structure he called Cosa Nostra. His testimony lit maps and gave agents fresh vocabulary. Valachi's story focused on Italian families, not on men like Meyer who operated beside them in overlapping lanes. Still, the effect rippled. Budgets grew for surveillance, informants, and complex cases that measured influence rather than just an arrest at a dice game. Agents trailed him from coffee shops to hotel lobbies. He learned to assume a tail and behaved like a man who had nothing to hide. because most days his acts were hard to turn into charges. He rarely touched cash. He lent through fronts. He kept decisions oral, unless a note would help him more than it could hurt. Taxmen never left. The Internal Revenue Service assembled files that tried to add up the unseen. They alleged hidden shares in casinos, phantom loans, unreported income routed through offshore banks. They subpoenaed associates, searched offices, and asked judges to let them open safe deposit boxes. He answered with patience. He argued that he was a consultant, that loans are not income, that travel to meetings does not prove control. Sometimes the argument won outright. Sometimes it carved away most counts. Sometimes it bought time while the government's witnesses fell apart. He preferred winning on the page to winning with a speech. On the page he could draw a line from point to point and make the path look straightforward. Florida politics remained a careful dance. In Dade County, cycles of crackdowns were often followed by long plateaus. Arrests made headlines. Quiet understandings put the city back to sleep. He never bragged about friends in office. He understood how fragile alliances are when a reporter calls before dinner. He sent help when a campaign needed a last push, and he did it through layers. If a sheriff warned that the heat would rise for a few weeks, he moved games to safer ground and let rooms cool. He disliked losing a night's take, but he disliked handcuffs more. He was getting older. He turned 60 in 1962. He exercised more, smoked less, and saw doctors when a cough lingered. Friends said he still solved arithmetic puzzles in his head faster than most men did with a pencil. He balanced medication schedules with the same detail he brought to a pit staffing. A traveler who had known him in the 1930s remarked, years later, that the biggest change was his voice had grown even softer. He had never been loud. Now he seemed almost to vanish while he spoke. Yet the content remained steel. If he told a manager to close a room for 3 nights, the manager closed it. If he asked for an audit of a collector, the collector's receipts were on his desk the next morning. Influence for him was not a stage, it was a checklist. There were brushes with courtrooms. Local prosecutors charged him from time to time with bookmaking or conspiracy to run a gambling house. In some cases, the charges shrank to fines. In others, they evaporated when judges suppressed evidence gathered with shaky warrants. He sometimes took an arrest as the price of doing business and kept the docket clear with bondsmen on call. When a grand jury asked him to talk, he weighed the risk and asserted his rights if a question aimed at self-incrimination. He had spent a lifetime measuring edges. He did not intend to slip on a word. He kept one eye on the Caribbean. The Dominican Republic lurched through change after the fall of its longtime ruler in 1961. Investors whispered about new opportunities for casinos when stability returned. Puerto Rico already had legal rooms under tight rules. Haiti beckoned briefly, and then frightened men away. The Bahamas looked best because the flights were quick, the language familiar, and the climate steady. Meyer sent small teams to scout and bring back numbers. Table drop per day, hotel occupancy, payroll, cost of goods, freight delays, customs headaches. If the math worked, he funded a tranche and watched. Technology crept into the business. Security cameras became common in count rooms. Slot machines modernized, replacing heavy gears with sleeker internals that made cheating harder and maintenance easier. Computers began to appear in back offices, spitting out printouts that let a pit boss compare this Friday to the last 4 Fridays in an instant. He did not pretend to be an engineer. He asked what the figures meant for cash flow, and whether the new systems made it more or less likely that an inspector could trace the full picture. He had no interest in fighting a trend he could bend to his will. Every few months, a magazine ran a feature on him. The photos showed a small man in a suit that didn't try to impress, walking near the water or sitting at a restaurant table. The stories repeated the same mix. The boy from the Lower East Side who loved numbers, the partnership with men who scared whole cities, the empire of betting that never showed up in company registers. He didn't sue. He didn't call the reporters. He ignored the noise. A gift in his work was the ability to let a story pass through him like wind through a screen. He was loyal to an old circle that had thinned. Luciano lived out his days in Italy, still honored in some corners and doubted in others. Frank Costello shifted toward a gentleman's routine, gardens and quiet lunches. Vito Genovese reached high and fell hard. New bosses rose, and with them came new styles of management. The flashier ones learned lessons he had taught others before. Attention is expensive. The patient ones lasted. He shared advice when asked, and kept out when pride warned him to stay off the line. He had known enough men to understand which ones would listen and which ones needed a fence to teach them where the edge was. In the second half of the decade, Legal tides changed. Congress passed a law in 1968 that set rules for court-approved wiretaps. Federal teams used the tool to listen to bookmaking hubs that had sounded safe for years. He responded by becoming even more boring. He took more walks. He waved off certain visitors. He spoke in person whenever possible. He used payphones for short calls, and never used a phrase that an agent could twist into the core of a case. If a friend started talking too freely, he ended the call. You can't get trapped by a sentence you never said. His family gave him reasons to sit still. A child's health needed regular attention. He paid for specialists and sat in waiting rooms like any other worried father. He brought magazines and kept appointments on a grid so tight that nurses smiled when he showed up 5 minutes early. He made sure his household functioned without drama. Holidays were small, with a cake and quiet gifts. He carried himself like a man whose peace depended on the next page of a ledger lining up. Rumors of a big tax case lingered near the end of the decade. Agents compared notes from Miami to New York to Las Vegas. They mapped companies that rented linens or bought produce for casino kitchens, then tried to prove those companies were shells that flowed back to him. He hired lawyers who loved footnotes. They dismantled theories one by one and demanded hard proof. Evidence gathered overseas moved slowly. Witnesses grew unreliable. He understood that the strongest tool he had left was time. If he kept his routine clean and avoided fresh entanglements, the past would be harder to weaponize. He still played chess. He still walked to the same bench by the water. The city around him changed. New towers rose, and airplanes passed over the beach at lower altitudes than they used to. He kept a light step. He enjoyed explaining to a younger friend why certain gambles were worth taking and others looked like fireworks, pretty then gone. He told them a lesson he had learned as a boy and never forgot. The house doesn't have to rush. The house just has to be here tomorrow. As 1969 closed, a different idea took hold. He had been born far from America. He had spent almost his entire life in its cities and courts. But there was another place, older in his memory and important in his faith, that offered a special doorway to people like him. He began to think about a flight that would not be a business trip, a place where he might breathe without an agent 2 tables away. The next step would be a gamble of a different kind, not a bet on a horse or a card, but on a country's law and a judge's patience. He booked the flight with the same care he brought to everything else. The idea had been building for months. He had been born in a land where his family's faith marked them, then raised in a country that gave him chances and court dates. There was another place that promised something different to people like him, the right to land, to stay, to start again with no one asking for permission slips from old offices. In early 1970, he stepped off the plane in a warm wind and moved through an airport whose signs read like a prayer he had learned as a child. He carried a small suitcase, wore a simple suit, and looked like any older tourist who liked sun and quiet streets. He was not trying to vanish. He was trying to breathe. He applied under a law that welcomed Jews home. Clerks stamped forms. A temporary card appeared. He rented a modest apartment near the water and walked every morning before the heat. He read Hebrew slowly but could still feel the weight of the letters. At a cafe, he sipped tea, watched the city wake, and answered polite questions from strangers who recognized him from American newspapers. He smiled, nodded, kept conversation light, and remained careful. He knew that his past had followed him on the same plane. He also knew that the letter of the law might shield him if he kept his steps small. The United States did not smile. Federal prosecutors had built a new tax case and now pushed the Israeli government to send him back. Diplomats wrote notes that carried both courtesy and insistence. Reporters knocked on doors and sent flashes to desks in New York. Meyer Lansky has turned up on the Mediterranean. In public, the new country called him a lawful immigrant. In private, ministers argued over the cost of defying a close ally for the sake of an old man whose reputation made headlines. He hired an attorney and made his claim clear. He qualified under the law just like any other Jew who wanted to live there, and he had not been convicted of any disqualifying offense. He kept his routine tidy. Morning walks, newspapers, calls to Miami that lasted 2 minutes and used no names. A chess game in a small park with a retired teacher who liked to joke about his slow bishops. He visited holy sites with a quiet face, pressed a hand to old stone and said little. He learned which baker sold the best bread on Fridays and which grocer would put aside small cucumbers he liked. Neighbors thought he was polite and private. Young men sometimes asked for advice about business. He spoke only in generalities. Know the rules. Collect on time. Avoid noise. Never spend tomorrow's income today. Pressure grew. The Interior Minister studied his file. The police handed over reports from American agencies that painted him as the banker of a gambling syndicate that had touched a dozen cities. Cabinet meetings stretched late. A case reached the High Court, where his lawyer argued that the law of return was a promise that did not shrink because foreign newspapers disapproved. The state replied that the same law allowed them to refuse entry or cancel residency for someone they believed would harm public peace. The judges listened, left the bench, returned, and ruled that the government could send him away. He wasn't accused of a specific crime in that country, but the political weight of his presence and the pressure from abroad tipped the scale. He packed with the same economy that had marked his arrival. Before he left, he took a last walk on the promenade and bought coffee for the man who had played chess with him all spring. He did not complain within earshot. He had always known that rules and relationships, not sentiment, decide a case. The United States waited with warrants that spoke in rows of figures. He paused in South America for a few weeks, a stop that gave his lawyers time to check what awaited him. Then he flew home. Agents met him at the airport. He was arrested without drama, processed and released on bond under conditions that made travel complex. The case that followed was the kind he had expected all his adult life: tax charges built from ledgers the government claimed to understand. Prosecutors said he had hidden income from gambling businesses in the United States and overseas, had routed money through fronts and foreign accounts, and had lied on his returns. They offered numbers and witnesses who said they had seen him in back rooms counting shares. The defense said he had lent money as a private investor, that loans are not income, that consultants can be paid without owning what they advise, and that a man's presence in a hotel corridor does not equal control. He appeared in court in a plain suit. He walked slowly. Years of stress, cigarettes, and long days had left their mark. Doctors filed reports about heart trouble and other ailments. Prosecutors called the medical papers a tactic. The judge weighed them and set a schedule that left room for hospital visits. The trial itself lacked the spectacle of the old Senate hearings. Instead, it turned on accounting. Witnesses tried to explain cash rooms. Agents tried to follow payments that moved across borders and back through companies with ordinary names. His lawyers, veterans of fights like this, forced the government to show the chain from an envelope to a signature to a bank. When someone on the stand wandered from what he actually knew into what he thought, they pounced. Jurors listened to weeks of arithmetic. They saw photographs of resorts they had read about in magazines. They heard about caches of chips, count rooms, slot routes, and envelopes that traveled on Friday afternoons. They learned that people in that world speak carefully and almost never write what matters. In the end, the government did not persuade them that he had earned and concealed the specific amounts in the indictment. They returned not guilty. The man at the defense table nodded once. He did not raise his hands or hug his lawyer like a prize fighter. He stood, thanked the court, and walked out with the same small steps he had taken in. An acquittal answers the charge in front of a judge. It does not change a life's outline. Agents still watched him. Reporters still called him the banker for rooms that never put his name on a document. A new law on organized crime gave prosecutors broader tools to charge patterns of racketeering and to seize assets. The Bank Secrecy Act demanded reports when large deposits crossed counters. Wiretaps with court orders became common. He responded as he always had, by removing himself from risky rooms and by keeping decisions oral. If someone had to hear something, they heard it in person while the two of them walked along Collins Avenue and then parted without a handshake that could be photographed. Florida remained his base. He ate at a deli where the owner knew how he liked his coffee. He swam when the lifeguards put up green flags. He visited a child whose health still needed careful attention and paid any bill a doctor put in front of him. He spent hours with his grandchildren on the floor of the living room, building towers out of blocks and letting them fall with giggles loud enough to drown out the television. He followed box scores, circled horses he liked out of habit even if he no longer bet them, and solved logic puzzles with a pencil worn down to a stub. The quieter his life became, the larger the legend around him grew. He was no longer an architect of vast new projects. He had seen what politics could do to a palace when he tried to remake Havana. He left the next round of hotel building to younger men and to corporations that now understood gambling in a way they had not 20 years earlier. He remained a lender and a counselor. If an operator in New Orleans wanted capital for machines, he tested the plan with small sums, then watched the reports for honesty. If a bookmaker in a northeastern city wanted a bridge loan to cover an unlucky week, he checked the man's history and offered tight terms. If an old friend needed cash to cover legal fees, the money appeared. He had always believed that a business is only as strong as its collectors and auditors. He kept his collectors punctual and his auditors skeptical. He kept a hand in the islands even as the map shifted. In the Bahamas, new leaders changed the tone. and began to push back against the kind of influence that had moved freely a few years before. Commissions asked questions about licenses. Scandals around casino oversight flashed in headlines. When investors with public stock listings replaced shadow financiers, the rooms took on a different rhythm. He accepted the change, took his slice where relationships remained, and stepped back where companies insisted on clean margins and old partners were no longer welcome. He had never romanticized a turf. If terms turned sour, he found other routes. Nevada grew bigger and cleaner at once. Big corporations entered the market. Accountants who had never walked a count room in their lives learned what a Dropbox was and wrote procedures that taught managers to reconcile every penny. State agents visiting a cage could now expect full ledgers and computerized reports. At the same time, some back-of-the-house tricks continued, now in more sophisticated shapes. Skims were smaller and more careful. The teams who did them were wary of microphones hidden in ceilings and cameras perched behind dark glass. Meyer's role was advisory now, often filtered through a lawyer or a friend who still had a voice with a property. He urged discipline. If you must touch a number, touch it lightly, and only after you verify that the system will not notice. Public culture found him in a new way. A movie appeared with a character who looked and sounded like him, a slight man who used calm sentences and arithmetic to run his part of the world. The story placed that character in Havana, on the eve of a revolution, and gave him a line about being bigger than great companies. Audiences loved the film. Writers debated who was who. He watched at home. He recognized parts that felt true and parts that made for a better plot than the truth could offer. The film helped fix his image in generations that had not seen his Senate appearance or his early years on New York streets. He did not send a letter to the studio. He let fiction be fiction and went back to his walk. The press kept asking about the fortune they were sure he had hidden. Numbers ballooned in glossy magazines. Reporters wrote digits with 7 and 8 zeros and printed rumors about Swiss vaults filled with the profits of a lifetime. He never answered with anything more than a shrug. When he died, people would argue about what he left, and some would be shocked at how small the sum on the probate papers was. He had moved money through other hands for decades. He believed in control without possession. That meant he could steer cash without having it in his name when a clerk typed an inventory. It also meant that in old age, the difference between legend and bank balance could be dramatic. He did not go near narcotics. He had avoided that business all his life because it brought heat that no amount of organization could reduce. He said so openly in private. If someone tried to draw him into a conversation about distribution or routes, he changed the subject or left the table. He stuck to gambling, a vice that could be managed, scheduled, and counted. He lent at hard terms when he considered the borrower reliable and the collateral real. He rejected loans that sounded like rescue missions for men who had already burned 3 creditors. He told young operators to learn something that older men never fully accepted. Cutting losses is a talent. The new laws drafted at the start of the decade grew teeth by the middle of it. Rico let prosecutors stitch together bookmaking, bribery, and skimming into a pattern. The Bank Secrecy Act forced banks to file reports that could later support conspiracy charges. Judges approved wiretaps on phone rooms that took bets and sent results to other states. Grand juries learned the names of couriers who had always believed they could carry envelopes forever without seeing a witness chair. He watched those shifts and adjusted. He preferred to back rooms that could pass a casual inspection, and to keep his own footprint light enough that a prosecutor could not draw a line from a bag of money to his front door. Friends from his first decades grew fewer. Some had died. Some had retired into houses with gardens and a schedule of medical appointments. Some had gone to prison, and upon release, discovered that the world had been redesigned while they were gone. He kept faith with a small core, an old partner who could be trusted with a memo that had to be typed, a lawyer who understood both trial law and tax, a doctor who answered calls at odd hours, a collector who never took a dollar that was not his. Loyalty, to him, meant obligations remembered, not toasts or stories told too late at night. He never liked informants, and now he assumed that any room with more than 3 people in it had one. He saw suits he recognized in hotel lobbies, men who claimed to be sales reps or insurance adjusters, but moved with the step of an agent and had an odd interest in the menu when he sat down. He treated them like weather. You cannot hate rain. You can carry an umbrella. He shortened meetings. He stopped eating at certain tables. He avoided the back dining rooms that once had felt safe and now felt like microphones. If something could be said outdoors, he said it while walking. If it could be kept to a nod, he used a nod. Occasionally, a local prosecutor charged him with a gambling offense. The arrest would be small and tidy. He would be photographed while leaving a station, a polite old man with careful hair, and the caption would write itself. In court, the case would often dissolve on legal ground: a search that went too far, a warrant that aimed too broadly, an informant whose story changed with the weather. He paid fines when that solved a problem, shook hands with a bondsman, and went home in time for dinner. He did not mistake these skirmishes for victory. He called them maintenance. His second marriage held. Teddy liked quiet more than he did. They ate at small places and brought half their meals home. He read to her in the evening. They took drives along the shore at dusk. He played with grandchildren in the yard and watched them squeal when a sprinkler made a rainbow. When a holiday came, the table filled with simple food. No speeches, no performances, just plates, hands, stories, and then a nap in a chair by the window while the beach sound drifted up from the street. The island that had cost him so much in the previous decade remained a sore spot others loved to press. Visitors asked him what he had lost. He would say that he lost the best-run operation he had ever built, and a hope that for once he could mix public permission with private precision. Numbers tossed by outsiders always seemed to him like guesses. He knew how many tables he had run, how many seats a showroom held, how the flow of a lobby could add up to a day's hold. He also knew how many hands the cash had to pass through between the felt and a bank abroad. He had built systems designed to work for years. They worked for months. Then they were gone. The 1970s brought a different kind of attention. A Senate body picked through casino loans. Teams of agents in the Midwest targeted skims tied to families there. Wire rooms in cities across the country went quiet on mornings, when arrest teams arrived with lists of phone numbers in their pockets. He watched as operations refined under his method wound up in indictments that named men a generation younger than him. He had become a reference point, someone reporters invoked when they wanted to describe an approach that turned vice into a ledger entry. From his small table at the deli, he read about cases in Las Vegas and Kansas City, and thought about the two truths that had never changed. Predictable cash draws attention, and attention is expensive. His health demanded more of his time. He saw cardiologists. He submitted to tests that required fasting and patience. He gave up cigarettes after false starts and then stayed away. Friends said he looked smaller than he once had, that the suit which fit him in the 1950s now seemed a size too big. He walked every day. He took his medicine the way a careful manager takes inventory, piece by piece, twice checked. If a day's list of calls ran long, he split it across morning and afternoon so he could rest between. He joked about his heart with the same dryness he used in business. A machine needs maintenance, replace parts when they squeak. He started to see his own story in the way younger men approached him. Some brought flattery and hoped for a loan. He declined most of them. Some asked to hear about Rothstein or Luciano. He told a few stories, not the sensational ones, and always with a lesson attached. He described how a smart man avoids unnecessary fights, how a ledger books the truth even when people won't say it aloud, and how a room's layout can make more money than any marketing plan ever written. He stressed the one rule that had saved him more than once: if you cannot explain a choice in one sentence, find another choice. He also saw himself in the hunger of strangers who wanted him to fit a script. They insisted that he had buried mountains of cash in Europe, and that he had ordered anyone who crossed him to disappear. He let them talk. He did not spend his last years chasing or arguing with myths. The older he grew, the more he let labels slide off. He knew his crimes and did not pretend otherwise. He also knew the parts of his life that did not make headlines: comforting a child during a bad night, paying quietly for a friend's hospital stay, writing checks to charities without a name attached, staying up late at the kitchen table, adjusting a budget so everyone could be paid on time. By the second half of the decade, the country had learned enough about organized crime to see it without the romance. A mob war could now ruin stock prices and crash a bank loan. Union funds under scrutiny turned from easy pipelines into legal traps. People who had once called him for advice on count rooms now called to ask which lawyers they should hire, because the counts were the least of their problems. He recommended counsel who understood both federal court and the backstories behind cases, men and women who could argue wiretap rules, conspiracy law, and the fine points of tax. Keeping a system running had shifted from a matter of smoothing odds to a matter of surviving in court. At home, his days changed only slightly. He kept a small office where he filed clippings and receipts. He favored cash, but accepted checks when they made more sense. He wrote notes by hand, each digit crisp, each letter a part of a system designed for clarity. He never allowed gossip to enter a room where he worked. If someone began a sentence with "I heard," he ended the conversation. Talk wastes time, proof builds cases. In both law and business, proof rules. As the 1970s edged toward their close, he did something he rarely allowed himself to do. He looked back with more feeling than analysis. Friends noticed it when he spoke about the Lower East Side, or about walking through Havana on a soft night when music spilled from every doorway. He still avoided self-pity. He did not excuse the things he had done by pointing to a hard childhood or to a country's contradictions. He framed his life as a set of choices in a world that offered profit to men who could live with their choices. He had lived with his. He still did. And he knew the last stretch would test the same skills the first stretch had demanded: patience, restraint, and a steady hand on whatever small levers remained in his reach. Atlantic City lit its first legal sign in 1978, and for a moment you could hear two eras talk to each other. On one side stood the old dream of private rooms and soft lights. On the other, a state that stamped licenses, counted chips, and told investors to bring accountants in droves. Corporations arrived with public filings and board meetings. Inspectors carried clipboards and calendars. People whispered that the small man in Miami would find a way to slide a hand into this new pocket. He didn't. He watched, measured, and kept to the margins. New Jersey wanted clean lines and visible owners. He knew better than to force himself into a picture that invited every camera in the region. He had already lived through enough shifts to know which ones stuck. State lotteries spread across the map and ate into the old neighborhood numbers. Off-track betting rooms in New York turned track bets into legal receipts. Bookmakers survived by offering credit, privacy, and faster payouts, but the easy days of a slip under the counter were gone. He told younger men who asked that the new environment favored patience, not swagger. Keep the house tight, keep the phone rooms quiet, and stay away from anything that looks like a shortcut. He had seen shortcuts turn into detours more times than he could count. Miami changed around him. The quiet town he had chosen for its calm became a staging ground for a different trade, loud and dangerous in a way gambling never had been. Nightly news carried scenes of sprayed glass and sirens. He wanted no part of that. He stuck to the routines that had kept him breathing: early walks, mid-morning coffee, short meetings that began and ended on the dot, and an afternoon rest. People who worked those new trades sometimes tried to sit near him. He stood, paid his check, and left. He had always believed that your company is a form of insurance. The wrong company voids the policy. He watched Las Vegas turn into a machine so efficient that it almost didn't need advice. Corporate teams analyzed hotel bookings, built show schedules that flattened slow seasons, and wrote internal rules that controlled every step from the drop to the count room. You could see his influence in the way the floors ran. Steady, calm, without ostentation, but his name lived only in stories. The state tightened its blacklist and added new names. Managers who had spent their life on the edge learned to protect their licenses the way a pilot guards his wings. When old friends called from a suite and asked for a thought, he often gave it in one sentence: keep your rooms clean, keep your paperwork tidy, and keep all promises on time. Skimming on the strip never disappeared. It just shrank and hid. Back offices designed by experts made stealing harder, and auditors trained to spot odd patterns pored over printouts. In the Midwest, where the money traveled before it reached home, federal teams followed whispers and built big cases around silent shares in resorts. They put microphones in offices, flipped couriers, and traced envelopes back to men who didn't like cameras. Those prosecutions hit in the late 1970s and early 1980s. He read about them with his coffee. He knew many of the players, not as friends, but as travelers on the same roads years earlier. The new era punished sloppiness. Some of those men had not learned the lesson he had taught his crews long ago. Precision buys time. He never stopped getting mail he didn't ask for. Biographers sent letters with lists of questions, some careful, some sensational. He chose not to participate. He knew that once his words sat on a page, they would live forever on someone else's terms. He had already seen a version of himself on movie screens, reshaped into a character with a different name, who stood by a balcony in Havana and spoke lines that made good theater. He preferred to sit in his living room and let actors pretend. The public wanted a simple story, clean lines between heroes and villains. His life had been made of calculations and compromises. Simple didn't fit. If he allowed an interview, it was brief. He told a reporter once that he was not a criminal mastermind, just a gambler who understood math and people. He said he had never ordered anyone hurt, and that his work was business, not warfare. Many heard humility, others heard evasion. The truth, like always, lay in the structure of his days. He did break laws. He profited from illegal games, bribed officials to buy room for those games, and hid income he didn't want taxed. He also insisted on avoiding chaos, kept violence away from public view, and spent quietly on hospitals and charities. He had a way of holding two facts in one hand and seeing them both as true. His son needed care, and that need never faded. He paid for therapists and aides, called doctors at odd hours, and adjusted his schedule around medical appointments. Family anchored him in ways that newspapers could not see. When he sat in a waiting room, no one cared about ledgers or old cases. A parent is a parent. He focused on small comforts, a blanket tucked properly, a favorite snack brought from home, a joke told softly to soften a long day. Those moments didn't excuse anything he had done, and he never offered them as a defense. They were simply part of the life he had built around the work. His court battles in the 1970s had drained energy he would never recover. An acquittal can look like a victory from a distance. Up close, it is months of stress, fees, and hours in rooms with stale air and hard chairs. After the not guilty verdict, he avoided fresh risks. The Bank Secrecy Act turned banks into quiet witnesses. RICO let prosecutors string acts together into a pattern. Wiretaps had evolved. He adapted by shrinking his role. He lent modestly, collected carefully, and hired lawyers to draft statements that made his position on paper look as small as it was in practice. If someone demanded a favor that smelled like a test, he declined. He had nothing left to prove to anyone. The islands he once used as safety valves gained new governments and new rules. The Bahamas, independent now, watched its casinos with sharper eyes. New owners with boardrooms in other countries took over. Internal controls replaced favors. Spreads narrowed. He kept a toe in where relationships remained, and said goodbye where the ground felt soft. Puerto Rico's gaming stayed tightly regulated, which meant fewer opportunities for a man who preferred to work in the space between the letter of the law and the silence of the night. He respected the new order because it did what he had always done in his head. It wrote the system down and forced it to run on schedule. He saw a last ripple from Havana even decades later. Visitors who had once sat in his island rooms told stories about shows and dice and moonlight on the sea. They remembered the charm. He remembered the count. He also remembered the day the doors closed and the way furniture sounded when it scraped across floors during a rushed shutdown. He had built something there that almost satisfied the contradictory craving that had run through his life. A public venture with private mechanics. A state had invited him to build. A revolution had told him to leave. You can fault him for the life he chose, but you cannot say he misread the lesson. Politics beats math when it wants to. Occasionally, an old case would try to rise again with a new label. Prosecutors in one city or another would float an investigation to the press. He would read the article at breakfast, circle nothing, and place the page under his plate to keep crumbs off the table. If a subpoena came, his lawyer answered it. If a reporter called, he let the phone ring. He never believed that public debates changed outcomes. Only paper, witnesses, and rules did that. He had won once on that battlefield and lost enough nights' sleep to know better than to go looking for another fight. His circle grew smaller, and with it grew the quiet. He met an old friend for lunch on Tuesdays. They talked about the track the way men talk about the weather, with the understanding that neither of them would be foolish enough to bet out loud. He called his daughter every evening at the same time. He took short drives at dusk with the windows down and the radio low. He still liked chess. The board comforted him because its rules never changed. You can forgive a man whose life had been spent bending rules for loving a game that punished that habit at once. He kept his own records tidy. He knew what was in the bank, what was owed, and what could be expected. He did not stash stacks of cash in freezers or walls. He believed in flow, not hoarding. That philosophy baffled the public when they tried to square the legend with the figures that would eventually appear in probate documents. Rumors loved the idea of a hidden fortune that could fund 10 lives. Reality looked like a man who had spent decades controlling money without needing to own it. When it left his hands, it left his name with it. That had been his protection and his curse. Age brought doctors into his routine. He scheduled tests, laid out pills in a row, and insisted on walking rather than being driven short distances. Friends warned him to take it easy. He would nod and meet them on the next block anyway. Stubbornness kept his schedule alive. So did the narrowness of his days. If you plan only what you can finish, you end every day having finished what you planned. He could live with that. Newspapers never stopped using the same adjectives about him. They called him diminutive, quiet, elusive, brilliant, ruthless, kindly grandfather, cold accountant, and architect of a national syndicate. They needed words that filled columns. He needed only the facts of his morning. In conversations with younger relatives, he finally said aloud what had driven him since his teens. People never stop gambling, and wherever they gamble, someone will organize the take. He had been that someone for nearly half a century. He neither apologized nor boasted. He stated it like a weather report. He warned his last students, men who came asking for advice, not realizing how little help they truly needed, that the future held more law than opportunity. State lotteries would pull small bettors into official channels. Casinos would spread under heavy regulation. Sports betting would someday become a fight between governments and corporations. The space left for people like him would narrow until it felt like a hallway you had to walk sideways to pass through. He told them to find other trades if they could. Some listened. Most did not. Every generation has to learn its own odds. Television stopped by once more near the end. A crew asked him to answer for a life that had been criticized and romanticized for decades. He spoke in the manner he always had, brief, measured, avoiding names and detail. He denied ordering violence. He admitted to gambling. He brushed away rumors about a vault in Europe. He spoke about the United States as a place that had given him everything. A chance to work, to raise a family, to fight in court rather than in the street. Parts of the audience believed him. Others felt they were watching a magician keep the best tricks off camera. He turned off the set and turned back to his routine. The last big trend of his era came from courts, not clubs. Federal juries convicted men in cases that mapped skims, pension loans, and sports betting networks that spread across multiple states. Transcripts read like diaries of the industry he had once helped standardize. The lesson was the one he had preached since the 1930s. If you cannot keep people calm and schedule strict, if you draw heat through noise or pride, the system fails. It was not humility that kept him out of those last chapters. It was age, discretion, and an understanding that the best way to avoid a fall is not to climb at all. He held on to small pleasures, a good rye bread, a morning sun that painted the water the right color, a day when a doctor said the numbers looked steady, a grandchild's drawing taped to a refrigerator door, a story told by an old friend that he had heard before but liked anyway. Those pieces added up to a piece no one would have predicted for him when he was a boy on the Lower East Side. Late in the journey, an illness that had been only a whisper began to speak louder. He felt it in his chest and in the way a flight of stairs now seemed like a hill. He went to his doctor without delay, listened to the explanations, and accepted the plan. He knew numbers. He understood charts. He followed instructions. He made the kinds of adjustments that old men make when they want to keep walking as long as they can. He cut back on travel. He handed off what business remained to people he trusted. He cleared drawers and threw away papers he no longer needed. He did not say much about the future. He had never been a man to speculate about what he could not control. At home, the room stayed neat. The television murmured at low volume. The phone rang less often. When it did, his answers were shorter. He did not want to be fed news about cases in cities far away. He did not need scores. He needed the feel of the day. He needed the sound of waves from the next street over, and the comfort of knowing that his family could reach him with a hand from the kitchen to the living room. He marked a few envelopes for his lawyer, a few more for his wife, and one for a friend who had earned more than a handshake but would never ask for it. He found himself thinking of the chess clock he used in the park. You can manage time, stretch it, compress it, prepare for it, but you cannot stop it. He had lived a life that tried to slow the world down with structure. Now he let time do what it always does. He slept more. He walked shorter distances. He sat on the same bench as the sun rose and then set. And he let himself notice details he had ignored for years. A gull's boldness, the way a child points at a cloud as if it were a new toy, the grace of people who help without being asked. He had once tried to live in a different country. He remembered the sea there, the feel of stone under his hand, the idea that a man with his past could still look for a home in a place that told him he was welcome by birthright. That door had closed behind him, and he had returned to the only city that fit his steps. He did not brood on that loss. He counted his luck, the kind you cannot take from a ledger, a long marriage, when his first one had failed, children and grandchildren who still visited, doctors who returned calls, a few victories in court that had kept him out of a cell. The arc of his time bent toward a quiet ending. He had outlived most of the men who had once filled his days. He had been called names he dismissed, and praised for skills he did not brag about. He had seen laws born to hunt him grow into tools that shaped an entire industry. He had lost and won, and then settled into a calm so steady that it would have bored the younger version of himself. That was his last lesson. Drama burns fast. Routine lasts. The last stretch of his life felt like a long tide that came and went without waves. He woke early, put on a plain shirt, checked the weather from the balcony, and decided whether to walk by the water before breakfast. The ocean he liked had always been a metronome. It did not cheer his victories or mourn his losses. It simply moved. He found comfort in that. After so many years spent guiding money through a maze, a morning that asked for nothing more than steps and air was a gift he knew how to unwrap slowly. He still followed the business, though from a distance that his younger self could never have tolerated. He read about Atlantic City's legal casinos, about hotel towers rising on the boardwalk under the eye of state regulators who had learned the lessons Nevada wrote. He watched Las Vegas turn into a laboratory of hospitality where everything could be forecast, from the number of hands per hour at a given table to the profit margin on a buffet line. He saw corporate names fill marquees once held by men who kept their first names private. He had helped build a world that now ran without him, and he accepted that detachment without resentment. The house, properly constructed, doesn't need its first carpenter forever. In Miami, he noticed a new kind of trouble passing through town. Loud where his world had valued quiet, sirens and headlines rose and fell that had nothing to do with cards or dice. He kept away from that noise the way a careful navigator steers around a visible reef. He still met with old friends, drank coffee in places that felt like living rooms, and limited his errands to a few blocks. If someone he did not trust sat down at the next table, he folded his napkin, paid his check, and left. His footprints grew lighter because he designed them that way. He could not avoid his name. Reporters still called and sent letters. Books appeared with covers that hinted at secrets. Some writers asked politely for his recollections. Others announced conclusions before they had heard his voice. He had learned long ago that the moment you let your words be typeset, you lose the right to decide where they travel. He believed in control, and he understood that there were arenas where he would never have it. He preferred living rooms to interviews, notes in his own hand to recordings, and memories held close to memories spun into someone else's story. From time to time, he allowed a brief conversation on the record. He denied certain legends that clung to him, affirmed obvious truths about his trade, and kept dangerous paths closed with a shrug. He reminded whoever asked that he had been a gambler who turned a country's appetite into a business. He said he had avoided the drug trade, not out of virtue but out of calculation. Too much heat, too much chaos, too hard to manage. He admitted to bribery where he needed it, and to bookmaking that existed because demand is a stubborn customer. He avoided big claims and spoke in the flat language of a man who believed the numbers mattered more than adjectives. He still found ways to be useful. When a former associate had a question about cash flow, he listened, asked 3 questions, and gave an answer in a sentence. When a young operator wanted to know how to keep a phone room quiet, he said to shorten lists, separate roles, and never let one person hold 2 keys. When a friend floated the idea of returning to an old method that had failed once already, he answered with a story about how repetition can be a polite name for denial. He had no interest in being a father figure. He simply knew that experience, like money, loses value when it sits idle. Courtrooms had mostly faded from his calendar. He had fought the case that chased him back from overseas. He had walked out a free man when jurors said the government had not proved what it claimed. Yet the shadow of law never vanished. New statutes tied patterns together. Banks filed reports that could spark a raid months later. Wiretap rules, sharpened by courts, made phone calls less safe than ever. He treated those changes as weather. You cannot stop a storm by arguing with it. You study the path, close the windows, and make your steps shorter. He had tried to make a different home once. The old country that had become new again for people of his faith had welcomed him under a law that felt as personal as a family letter. For a time he walked streets that felt both foreign and familiar, and wondered whether a life defined by calculation could be gentled by belonging. The United States asked for him back. Ministers debated. Judges weighed laws against politics. In the end, the promise that had seemed absolute turned conditional. He left without spectacle. He never spoke bitterly about that reversal. He had lived too long in a world where outcomes often depended on rooms you never saw. At home, he doubled down on ordinary routines. He took care of a son whose needs did not end, paid for care without fuss, and measured the day's success by calm, not by cash. He and Teddy, steady as a metronome beside him, shared meals that would never appear in glossy magazines. They drove at sunset and named the colors. He called his daughter at the same time every evening and asked about the little things. He had once dealt in figures that measured hotels and networks. Now he watched the clock for pill times and examined grocery receipts for habit's sake. He still believed in lists. He had lived within a set of rules he built for himself while the street made him quickly old. The rules stayed consistent. Avoid spectacle. Pay on time. Keep books honest inside your circle, even if the business outside the circle is not, and never confuse friendship with credit. He had seen empires wobble because gossip replaced math. He had seen rooms shut because the wrong person got proud at the wrong moment. He had seen brilliant men fall because they mistook fear for respect. He had made his share of errors. He had lost a fortune on an island to a force he could not factor. He had paid for lawyers until he could have built a hotel from their invoices alone. He had also outlasted men who once frightened him. With age came a different patience. He still loved chess, not because it made him feel clever, but because it removes luck. In that quiet, someone sitting across the table from him had to plan, to discipline impulse, to see what a move would cost. Not only this turn, but 3 turns later. He would sit with retirees, with young men who had seen movies about him and wanted a story, with strangers who understood only that the small man in the plain jacket watched the board with a kind of tenderness. He rarely spoke while he played. When he won, he touched the king gently, and nodded to the opponent as if to say that games are mirrors, and we should thank them even when they make us look simple. He kept a relationship with the past the way one keeps a garden, a little attention every day, no dramatic pruning, and an acceptance that some plants will never grow the way you want them to. He visited old neighborhoods in memory. He underestimated nothing. The fear that had pushed families across oceans, the tight rooms of the Lower East Side where children slept 2 to a bed, the countless small acts of hustle that kept a mother's pantry from going empty between paydays. He did not excuse crime with poverty, but he understood how certain streets make certain choices look like doors instead of walls. The world around him had its own rhythms. State lotteries had turned a corner store dream into a government program. Horse tracks still ran, though the crowds felt older. Bookies still took calls, but now they competed with official outlets. Legislatures debated casino expansions, not as moral puzzles but as budget proposals. What he had once done outside the law had been partly absorbed by it. He found the irony both predictable and dryly funny. A society that scolded men like him had learned to sell the same thrills with better lighting and promised oversight. He read about prosecutions in cities he had once visited like a traveling salesman. Kansas City, Cleveland, Chicago, Milwaukee, Las Vegas. The cases mapped old habits and new methods. Prosecutors showed juries how money left a pit and arrived in a back office, then in a bag, then in a car, then in a city far away. Microphones hid behind vents. Couriers told stories in exchange for leniency. Pension funds once used for loans now appeared as exhibits. He recognized the diagrams. He heard the echo of principles he had taught, even when their students had ignored the part about restraint. He did not cheer convictions. He did not mourn them. He read, folded the paper and put it aside. Friends died. He attended funerals when he could, and sent flowers when he could not. He kept photographs in an album he opened only rarely, as if memories were fragile pages that might tear if handled carelessly. One picture showed 3 young men in suits they believed were sharp, standing on a sidewalk full of pushcarts. Another showed a hotel lobby with a staircase shaped like a promise. Another showed a pool that curved toward a foreign sea. He had learned not to live in those pictures. They were markers, not maps. He had always resisted talking about violence. He knew too well that power in his world had often been enforced by men who delivered hard messages. He did not pretend that he had built an empire without intimidation. He maintained that he had pushed for control instead of spectacle, settlement instead of blood. That claim satisfied some and angered others. He did not ask anyone to absolve him. He simply told the story as he remembered it, the way a dollar flows when tempers are cool, and the way it evaporates when pride takes the wheel. Now and then, someone from law enforcement would introduce himself at a coffee counter and say, without rancor, that he had spent a decade trying to place him at the center of a particular chart. The agent might be retired now, with time to fish and grandchildren to tire him out. They would trade small talk about the city. The agent would say that the job had changed. He would mention computers, large cases, new statutes, and the feeling that the old world had either been caged or had retired. Meyer would nod, smile at the idea of many pages finally closing, and buy the man a coffee. War stories, like numbers, can be shared without harm if you keep them general. His health finally asked for a seat at the table. He had spent years with doctors and tests, and he accepted their authority the way he once accepted a judge's schedule. Show up, listen, follow instructions, return when told. He reduced cigarettes, then put them down. He walked shorter distances but walked them every day. He slept more. He allowed himself an afternoon nap without guilt. If an errand required a long drive, he considered whether the errand truly mattered. He liked to joke that he had run his body like a business that knew how to squeeze a dime out of a nickel, and now the books asked for a calmer plan. He was not a religious man in a public sense, but age pulled certain threads closer. He gave more to charities that worked in hospitals, schools, and community centers. He wrote checks without attaching his name to press releases. He did not try to buy forgiveness. He did something simpler. He paid bills that improved a stranger's day. He had always liked the feeling of a ledger balancing. These gifts balanced something in him. He thought sometimes of the Navy men he met during the war when the docks needed order. The city had burned where it could not afford to. The country had asked unusual allies to help deliver ships out of the harbor on time, and unusual allies had answered. He did not brag about that episode. He drew a quiet satisfaction from the idea that once, the skills that made him suspect to prosecutors had proven useful to a nation that needed ships to sail without trouble. He had learned then that a man's reputation could be a wall or a bridge depending on the day. In those last years, he heard a young singer in a lounge cover a standard that had played in Havana when his hotels were new. The voice was different. The room was smaller. The crowd was polite. He felt the ache of memory in a way he recognized and allowed it to pass. Nostalgia can be a kind of theater. He preferred the show he could still direct. Sip, listen, leave before the noise rose. He did not keep treasure maps. He did not sketch routes to vaults in Europe for relatives to follow. He believed everyone should understand the simple truth of his finances, however much it surprised people who had watched too many films. He had lived by moving money, not by storing it with his name attached. He had invested, collected, paid, redistributed, and protected. When he died, court records would show a modest sum. Commentators would write lines that started with "only." He would have smiled at that and said that they were not wrong. Comfort, not opulence, had been his target in old age. The underworld had taught him that a pile you can see attracts hands. He preferred flow to piles. His end came in winter. The diagnosis, when it finally arrived, met a man who no longer negotiated with time. He went into the hospital when he needed to, returned home when he could, and framed each day as a list whose last item was sleep. Teddy kept watch and kept the house still. Family came and went with meals and stories. Old friends called and spoke in voices that softened the edges. He accepted help like a man who had learned, at last, that control can include the grace to let someone else hold the door. On a January day in 1983, the board closed on its own. He was 80. The newspapers wrote headlines with phrases they had used for years. Syndicate, gambler, accountant, quiet mastermind, and they retold the highlights with an air of finality that felt both earned and insufficient. They listed cities like chapters. They argued about his total wealth. They quoted lines from a movie in which a character who looked like him stood on a balcony and spoke about being larger than great companies. They printed photographs that showed him as a young man and as an old one. The facts, the legends, the conjectures, all of it blended into the public version of a life that had been carefully private. A funeral does not answer questions. It closes a door. He was buried in Florida, under sky he had learned by heart. The eulogies were brief. The rabbi did not pretend to make simple what was not. Family stood near and said goodbye in a language older than all of them. Strangers who had once collected envelopes for him or reported on him, read the notices and thought their own thoughts. Some declared the end of an era. Others said the era had ended long ago and this was just the footnote catching up. Afterwards, the debates continued. How large had his reach truly been? Had he been the architect people claimed, or had he been one careful contractor among many? Did his style, order, calm, system, extend the life of an industry that would otherwise have burned itself out sooner? Had he ever walked away from deals that would have made him richer because they were too loud? Did he secretly direct the worst acts attributed to his world, or had he genuinely preferred to avoid violence? Those questions sat on shelves with spines that will never crack to a final answer. He did not leave a memoir to settle them. The legacy visible to anyone who looks closely is not a monument or a quote. It is a method. The transformation of lawbreaking from street fights into managed enterprises, the shift from brash displays to conference tables, the habit of treating a city map like a balance sheet, those changes bear his fingerprints. He borrowed and refined. He was not alone in that project. He had partners and rivals who brought their own talents. But the image of a small man turning numbers into order is why his name endured. For better and worse, he proved that crime can mimic business so closely that reformers often have to fix the business to reach the crime. He also leaves a different kind of memory with those who knew him at home. A grandfather who kept promises, a husband who learned to share quiet, a father who never stopped sitting in waiting rooms, a man who liked rye toast and brought the same dessert to a neighbor's house every Friday night. Those details complicate the cartoon some people prefer. They do not erase the other truth. He built systems that broke laws and profited from weakness. Lives are not single-note songs. He was a chord with dissonance built in. Years after he died, casinos spread under official seals. Business schools taught classes that included case studies on the hospitality systems that once belonged only to back rooms. Sports betting began to crawl toward legitimacy, at first in cautious steps and then faster, with phones turning into books that carry bets across state lines under licenses. The market he understood better than most did not vanish. It changed uniforms. In that sense, the country met him halfway long after he was gone. Some myths have refused to leave. People still tell stories about suitcases filled with cash, about Swiss accounts that no court ever found, about orders given with a nod that changed the course of a city's night. The myths say more about the storyteller than about the man. They reveal a desire to pin everything on a mastermind, because a mastermind makes chaos feel less random. He would have smiled at that too. He seldom believed in geniuses. He believed in taking advantage of human habits and in making sure the trains ran on time. If you walk past certain hotels in Miami Beach, you can still imagine a small figure at a table by the window, with a newspaper folded neatly and a cup of coffee cooling in quiet air. If you stand in an old Havana lobby, you can still feel the curve of a staircase that led guests to a floor where dice clicked under bright light. If you drive past a racetrack and hear the call to the post, you can still hear the shadow of a phone room where a clerk once wrote numbers in a fast hand. These are echoes, not ghosts. They are reminders that a life can reach into a city's routines long after a heart stops. He taught, by example, that order has its own charisma. He disliked chaos because chaos wastes money. He emphasized that discipline protects more than reputation, it protects the bottom line. He advised men to measure twice and speak once, preferably not at all. He cleaned messes by rerouting money, the way a plumber fixes pressure with a new line. He had talent at making people who disliked each other behave because behaving paid them both. Those skills can be used for good or ill. He chose a lane that made him rich and infamous. He paid a price that looked small to people who wanted him caged and large to anyone who cared for him in unguarded moments. Hindsight invites parables. One could say that the boy who loved numbers discovered that numbers can tame anything until politics intervenes. One could say that the immigrant learned to become a native son of a country that never fully forgave him for what he did to its laws. One could say that he rose because he believed in systems more than in swagger. One could add that he fell only when he tried to blend his systems with legitimacy and learned that legitimacy has laws of its own. All of that carries some truth and misses some. The complete story, like most lives, resists a neat moral. If there is a safe conclusion, it is this: he managed risk better than most men, and taught others to do the same. He did that in card rooms and in kitchens, in back offices and in hospitals. He did it by staying calm when others felt the floor tilt. He looked ahead 3 moves, and then avoided the impulse to announce how clever he had been. He knew that the measure of a decision is not the applause it gathers today, but the absence of a crisis tomorrow. Think again of the chessboard at the park. A rook waits, a bishop watches a diagonal, a knight guards 2 squares at once. He once hovered over a piece as a young man passing by recognized him and stopped. The young man asked for a lesson. He said without looking up that the only lesson worth keeping was simple: do not move unless you know why, and when you move, make it count. The young man nodded as if he understood. Most of us only learn later what that sentence costs to live by. He is gone. The stories remain. Some will always be louder than they deserve. Some will not be loud enough. The balance is the reader's work. A bedtime story ends with quiet, not because the day's events were soft, but because rest makes sense after the math has been done. He was not a hero. He was not a demon. He was a builder of structures in a world that punished the unstructured. He found advantage where others found excitement. He preferred the ledger to the headline. He believed the numbers more than he believed anyone's claims about himself, including his own. The bench by the water stands empty in the morning until someone sits and opens a newspaper and takes out a pencil. Waves move as they did before and after him. Somewhere a casino cage reconciles a night's count. Somewhere else a group of friends argues about whether the man's fortune was hidden or simply never existed in a way that probate could capture. Somewhere, a waiter in an old lounge puts on a record that was first played under a ceiling he paid for. Somewhere, a grandson tells a child that the small man in the photo loved chess and quiet and always arrived 5 minutes early. There is a special kind of power in being the person others rely on when they cannot rely on themselves. He was that person for a long time, for people with different suits and accents, across cities that shared bet slips the way other places share weather. He delivered stability in exchange for a cut. He offered routine in exchange for obedience. He traded risk for loyalty. He built a network out of human wants and made it hum. Then he let it all go slowly, a piece at a time, until what was left looked like an ordinary life near the water. A man can be more than one thing. He can be dutiful and ruthless, loving and calculating, generous and exacting. He can bring order to a room that has never had it, and then insist on a quiet dinner at home. He can break laws and recite prayers. He can read the sports page and the obituaries with equal attention. He can choose again and again to be early instead of late. He can spend decades making sure every column adds up and then leave behind a world that still argues about whether the sum was worth the effort. If you listen closely, the last sound in his story is not a gavel, or a gunshot, or applause. It is the dry, satisfying snap of a ledger closing at the end of the day. The sound a careful hand makes when the numbers finally align. The soft click that tells you routine has survived another round. For a man who believed that quiet is the safest shield, that sound was the only ending that ever made sense. The story did not stop with a funeral notice. Files kept breathing, reporters kept writing. Agents who had retired opened their basement boxes and found memos with his name stamped in black at the top. Young readers who knew him only from film characters learned that their favorite scene had a source in a man who liked pencils and disliked speeches. The institutions that had pushed against him, committees, bureaus, state boards, continued reshaping themselves around the problems he had exposed simply by being good at what he did. Look at the paper trail that surfaced in the years after he was gone. Federal files ran to thousands of pages, a portrait in fragments. They showed a strategy that looked mundane at first glance, and then impressive when you saw it run for decades. Keep ownership cloudy, push control down a layer. Use loans and consulting agreements instead of signatures on doors. Allow partners to enjoy the front, then hold them to strict schedules when the time comes to divide. Spread investments across regions so that one raid, one mayor, or one scandal cannot drain the river by itself. None of that sounded grand enough for a headline. It was, however, the kind of discipline that turns a loud trade into a durable one. Historians argued about his rank in the world he helped organize. Some said he had been the banker that every captain visited when he wanted stability. Others said the title accountant had given him too much credit, that the machine would have run with or without him. The fair reading sits between those poles. He neither invented gambling nor ran every table from a secret room. What he did was set standards. He taught men from very different neighborhoods to adopt paperwork and rules, to settle disputes with a vote when possible, and to admit that chaos destroys profits faster than any prosecutor. He helped a group of rivals act like shareholders. That was his contribution, and it lasted. He never called himself an innovator. He called himself practical. Listen to how he approached the racing wire. Information, he said, is oxygen. If morning odds don't arrive, phone rooms panic and make mistakes. So he backed whatever service would keep oxygen flowing, and when a service stumbled, he switched lines rather than fighting a losing case in the papers. Watch his method with machines. Cities shut doors. Send the machines where doors open. Mayors come and go. Keep trucks ready. The line between legal and illegal shifted across a map. He moved with it. That agility, more than any one scheme, is why his name lasted while others faded. People loved telling stories about a secret fortune waiting in a foreign bank. The romance of a vault buried under a mountain can be irresistible. After he died, the figures listed in court and probate records disappointed anyone who wanted a movie ending. The amounts were not nothing, but they were far smaller than legend. Either the money had been better hidden than anyone could prove, or as he often hinted, the money had never sat still in places that produced tidy inheritance lists. He believed in flow, not stashes. That belief shielded him during his life. It also meant that his final tally looked modest to anyone who counted riches in lumps rather than streams. Consider how the law changed in response to men like him. The government learned to think in terms of enterprises. Instead of treating each bet as an isolated act, investigators began to map the entire system. Phones, couriers, managers, lenders. Wiretap rules matured so that agents could listen, with a judge's permission, to conversations that stitched states together. Banking laws required reports when cash crossed certain thresholds. New statutes allowed prosecutors to say, "This is not a random set of crimes, this is a pattern with a purpose." Those tools made headlines in cases that came years after his peak. His shadow still sat in the courtroom when jurors viewed charts of money leaving a count room, reaching a bag, and then taking a flight to a city many miles away. He had felt those tools closing in long before they reached their full effect. That is why he had tried something bold at the end of the 1960s, seeking a home in a country that promised it by law. The legal argument there turned on a single sentence: whether a person with his past could claim a right that was written without qualifiers, or whether public safety let ministers say no. Judges answered for that country and sent him away. It was a quiet legal drama that exposed the tension between a promise made to a people and a government's concern about optics and alliances. He accepted the outcome with more calm than many of his supporters did. He had lived by the truth that rooms you cannot see decide plenty. Popular culture loved the version of him that stood on a balcony in a famous film and delivered a line about strength that sounded like a thesis. Friends said he saw that movie and shook his head at its dramatics, even while acknowledging the recognition scattered through it. The character had different words, a different fate, a different story arc. But the shape, the small man, the careful voice, the obsession with control felt close enough to stick. In the decades since, that performance has become the way many first meet him. The real person remains more ordinary, and in some ways more impressive, less theatrical, more durable, never tempted by scenes that make good posters. His work on the New York docks during the war stands as one of the strangest chapters when viewed through a simple moral lens. He and others who held sway in neighborhoods by reputation and fear were consulted by naval intelligence because the harbor had to function without fires or interruptions. The deal was practical. The result was fewer incidents and smoother shipping. Years later, when parole boards considered cases, this episode sat in the file like a note from an unlikely character witness. It did not clean anyone's record. It did show that the boundary between government and the underworld can blur under strain. He never bragged about it. He filed it away as proof that order has many buyers. He maintained to the end that he avoided narcotics. Associates repeated the claim after he was gone. Whether the stance was moral or strategic hardly matters. What counts is that he saw that trade as uncontrollable and avoided it the way an engineer avoids a bridge with a faulty design. He put his money into bets because bets could be modeled. A city's appetite for wagering does not spike and dive the way a shipment does. Bets are a habit. Habits produce graphs. Graphs can be planned around. That was his faith, and he kept it. In the Bahamas, which became a convenience after Havana shut its doors, his influence was felt through routines more than through photo ops. Hotels needed staff and standards. Casinos needed procedures. He helped import both from places where he had already run them. As independence arrived and multinational companies took pride of place, the industry shifted toward what you now see everywhere: cold compliance mixed with warm hospitality. The space for an old hand shrank. He understood the new calculus and stepped back. He did not need to be present where a 1,000-page manual could do his job. Any look at his life has to admit the ache at its center. He was proudest of systems that stayed invisible. He wanted mastery without exposure. Las Vegas was a paradox for him because it made part of his craft legal while keeping him personally unwelcome. Havana had looked like a way to keep both halves together. Invitations printed, taxes paid, shows sold openly, cash counted carefully in rooms that were not dens but departments. That experiment ended when politics turned the key. He never pretended to be surprised that politics had won. He did let himself mourn a missed case study, the kind a man like him would find meaningful, a lawful stage with illegal instincts disguised as efficiency. He did not write letters to the editor. He did not publish a memoir. He left remarks behind only in court transcripts and brief interviews where he stayed in the shallow end. That absence of a first-person account has let others fill the space, sometimes with care and sometimes with fantasy. The result is a man you can approach from multiple sides and see different things. One reader sees a businessman who could have found success in any field and chose the crooked one. Another sees a parasite who exploited people's hopes. A third sees a flawed genius of process whose best work would have been building hospitals or airports. He never did us the favor of settling the argument. Ask people who stood across from him at a chessboard what they remember. Many will say the same thing. He looked at the whole board. He did not lunge. He calculated quietly, respected the rules, and showed patience when a position looked cramped. If the game fell apart, he resigned quickly rather than try a trick that would only embarrass them both. He carried that approach into every room that mattered. When a manager panicked about a bad week, he adjusted terms. When a collector invented excuses twice in a row, he stopped looking for a third chance. He brought a game's temperament to life's messy patterns. He also carried contradictions that refused to fade. He paid doctors for a child for whom the state would not have spent enough. He slipped checks to clinics and schools that sat in neighborhoods far from any pit. He helped strangers in hospital corridors because he recognized an expression he had seen on his own face. He also maintained a world built on vice, where losing is part of the design, and where desperation can be a revenue stream. He did not hide from that truth. He accepted it as the price he was willing to charge and to pay. As for his end, it was ordinary, which may be the most striking thing. A man who had once turned a city's nightlife into an annuity died the way many retired men do, in a small place, with family nearby, under the care of nurses who track charts and change linens. The cause was an illness so common it lacks drama. The coverage that followed ran through the familiar list. The shock was not the words, it was the distance between the life they described and the quiet image of a grandfather at breakfast. Stories often end with surprise or revelation. His ends with a ledger closed, not with a twist. If you search for meaning in that ending, you can find this. He believed in the safety of the boring. He believed that an unexciting routine is a shield, that a quiet table is a safer place than a loud one, that a day which arrives and departs on schedule is a success. He built an empire on that belief, made enemies and allies with it, and eventually used it to shrink his world into something manageable and humane. A man who spent his youth sprinting, learned to prefer walking. That too is a kind of lesson. Walk back through the cities he touched. The Lower East Side taught him that a dollar has to be counted twice. New York's back rooms taught him to run a meeting without letting the meeting run him. The South taught him to move goods where the rails would carry them, and to trust only those who counted the same way he did. Florida taught him that sunshine can hide a lot of activity if you keep the angles right. Nevada taught him that legality without restraint is just a pause before a scandal. Cuba taught him that the best system can be undone by a single decree. The islands taught him to test every handshake with a small task before trusting it with a large one. Each lesson has a cost. He paid in cash, in sleep, in friends, in reputation, and in the heavy maintenance that comes with living so long under attention. His influence keeps showing up in places that no longer use his name. Casino floors now are designed to manage attention spans and travel paths exactly the way he once recommended. Internal controls that move cash through multiple counts with strict separation of duties look like a formal version of the guardrails he insisted on before anyone wrote them into policy. Even state lotteries borrow his tone when they emphasize routine and reliability, turning risk into something that can be scheduled and audited. He might have found a certain satisfaction in that. Not pride, exactly. Recognition. In the end, the best way to hold his life in view is to picture two rooms. In one, men argue loudly, wave hands, make threats, win today and lose tomorrow. In the other, a small man writes numbers, asks questions that begin with how and when, and insists on the business working even when nobody feels like working. He chose the second room and taught others to prefer it too. He did not make the world better by doing so. He made it more organized. For a time, that was enough for him. For a country that eventually had to write laws to match that organization, his presence forced a kind of clarity. So the tide goes on. A bench waits for someone who likes to read the sports page slowly. A city stirs awake and opens small stores where bets are legal now, under rules thick with lawyers' ink. A family gathers and tells a child that the man in the photo loved order because it kept people fed and kept tempers down, and that he also did wrong, and that grown-up stories are like that sometimes. In another place, a historian runs a finger down a file and wonders at the smallness of the handwriting that moved so much weight. The ocean he watched never cared about any of this. It has its own math. That is why he liked it. It reminded him that all systems, honest or crooked, are temporary, while the rhythms that outlast us don't need our permission to continue. He measured himself against the tide and accepted his place. That acceptance did not save him or undo what he had done. It simply let him live out the last pages with a steadiness that gives this long story an ending soft enough to sleep on.